May I have attention, please? We'll start the afternoon session now. So please take your seat and then switch your mobile phone to the silent mode. Welcome back. We hope you enjoyed the network lunch, and we have our final session awaiting us with the theme of joint growth and sustainable development. Each of the speakers will have 15 minutes presentation. Our first speaker to stage is Mr. Jonathan McClory. Mr. Jonathan McClory is the partner at Po틀랜드 and leads the firm's place branding practice. He is a specialist in placing branding, soft power, and cultural relations. Jonathan has advised senior government clients in the UK, Europe, and Asia on reputation, policy, and effective global engagement. His talk will be on soft power and innovation, South Korea experience. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Jonathan McClory.
Thank you, and thank you for awarding me a PhD as well. Thank you. I'd like to thank President Park and the organizing committee of KISTEP for the invitation. I'm very excited to be here today with you, especially this is my first trip to Korea and to Seoul. I've been around Asia quite a bit, but I haven't had the pleasure yet. I'm very happy to be here, so thank you. I have to say I feel slightly like the odd man out in this conference, in that I don't work directly in innovation or science or technology or academia, but the work that I do is around advising governments, primarily on how they can engage better globally and how they work on improving their global reputation, and not just through communication, but through action and policy and behavior, as well as communication. And it's in that spirit that my company, Portland, working in collaboration with Facebook and an international polling company called Comres, published a study last month, which we launched at Facebook's offices in London. And that study was called the Soft Power 30. And we created a composite index of soft power where we scored and ranked countries according to their soft power, which I'll get into the explanation of that project and the concept of soft power through my presentation, and then just put into context the Korean experience and talk a bit about the relationship between innovation and soft power, which I certainly think is important and worth considering in our day-to-day work. So I'll start because I'm used to speaking to international relations scholars or politicians or senior officials from ministries of foreign affairs or maybe ministries of culture. So it's not often I get to speak to a more diverse group. So I think it's probably worth just doing some kind of basic concept introductions just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So I want to start with what is soft power, but I'll take a step back from that, and because soft power is an international relations concept, we'll just start with what is power in general. So power in international politics is the ability of one actor, which might be a country or a non-state actor, to affect the behavior of another actor to make them do something they otherwise would not have done. So that's power. It's essentially influence to change behavior. So we can split power up into two categories, broadly speaking. And the first category is hard power. And hard power relies on economic or military might to change behavior. So it relies on strategies like military force or the threat of military force, economic sanctions, or even inducements of payments, so simply paying somebody to do what you want them to do. In contrast to that, soft power describes the ability to change behavior through attraction and persuasion. And it was Joseph Nye, who's a Harvard professor, who originally coined the term soft power back in 1990. And he described the sources of soft power in three primary ways, and they are culture, and this can be high culture, so it could be classical music, the Bolshoi ballet, but it can also be pop culture. It can be K-pop or One Direction in Britain. And then the second factor is political values, and as well as the quality of government and political institutions. And then the third source of soft power is kind of global engagement or foreign policy. It's essentially the extent to which a country is seen as acting with moral authority in the world. So that's essentially what soft power is. And Joseph Nye his simplified version of soft power is the ability to get somebody to want what you want, to get them to do something simply because they admire and they like you. So why does soft power matter? Why should we care about this obscure international relations concept? Well, in the report that we published last month, we argued that there are two main megatrends which really make soft power more important to successful foreign policy. The first of these megatrends is the rise of networks. And this has come about primarily through the diffusion of power. And some of these megatrends and these the factors underpinning them were actually brought up, I think, by earlier in our OECD presentation. So they shouldn't come as any sort of surprise. But power diffusion, so power is moving, global economic and political power is moving from west to east. But it's also moving away from governments altogether towards non-state actors. And urbanization is part of this as well, as we see more and more cities are actually having an impact on the global stage. So an example of that could be the C40 group of mayors who are really trying to have an impact on the climate change debate. So the second megatrend is that, this might sound cliche, but we live in an increasingly digital world where more and more of the world is playing out online. And the digital and ICT revolution has essentially meant democratization of access to information. It speeds across borders incredibly quickly. And this has led to greater transparency in many ways. So from the perspective of governments, they now have to be very careful to make sure that their actions and communications are perfectly aligned. Because if they aren't aligned, if a government does one thing and says another, people will immediately see this. It also means that propaganda is effectively dead. I mean, it doesn't mean that governments no longer try to use propaganda, but it's much less effective. And people are smarter now, they have more access to information, and they're likely to spot propaganda and call it when they see it. So the combination of these two megatrends essentially means that we live in a much more complex, multipolar world with a much more crowded global stage. And it also means that to get anything done in the world really requires collaboration. It requires working in networks. And actually, I think it was Dr. Chi who mentioned, the big global problems that we face, whether it's climate change or controlling epidemics or stopping the proliferation of nuclear weapons. All of these sort of big global challenges we face cannot be addressed unilaterally. They have to be addressed through collaboration. Now, soft power is important because soft power is essentially the fuel that drives collaboration. It's the power of attraction that inspires countries to get together, not just countries, but also non-government actors as well, to get together and work in effective collaboration towards solving some of these problems. So that's roughly what soft power is and why it's increasingly important. So the reason that we developed this Soft Power 30, this new composite index of soft power, is that there's been a growing enthusiasm amongst commentators, journalists, government leaders to want to use soft power. There's enthusiasm for soft power, but that enthusiasm to use it has not been matched by an increase in understanding or capability around the use of soft power. And Joseph Nye, who I mentioned, who originally developed the concept, this is a sort of simplified model that he developed of how you convert soft power into influence. And it starts with resources. Understanding and knowing what the soft power resources a country has, that's the first step. The problem is soft power is very difficult to measure, and there are very few, if any, governments that have really gone about systematically measuring and quantifying the exact soft power resources that they have to then put to use in the field. So it's only with a clear understanding of what soft power resources a country has that they can begin to hope to use it. So with that in mind, we set out to address this challenge of measuring soft power. And I would say some of the reasons that it's difficult is that there are a number of factors that go into a country's soft power. It's also inherently subjective, which makes it challenging as well. So what we did, the Soft Power 30, essentially is a composite index of just over 65 metrics, and it measures the soft power resources of countries. So we designed it to be a tool to understand the relative strengths and weaknesses of a country's soft power. And it's an analytical framework that combines both objective metrics, so statistical data that we sourced from the OECD, the World Bank, IMF, among other highly respected sources of secondary data. And what I want to say as well is that it's not an overall measure of influence. What this is more of a measure of potential for influence. It's about the resources countries have that make them attractive. It's then up to the governments of those countries to use those resources effectively. So I just want to take you through very quickly the framework and how we built it. So as I said, it's comprised of both objective and subjective metrics. And this is the objective part of the index, and it's comprised of 6 different sub-indices, and these 6 sub-indices or categories are essentially they're like little indexes in their own right, and so we can actually break down how countries have performed along each of these 6 categories. Pardon me. So the 6 are enterprise, the first one, which kind of captures the attractiveness of a country's business and economic model. And it also captures a country's capacity for innovation. The second category is culture. And like I said, this captures both very high elite culture, but also pop culture as well. The third category, and this was something that we worked closely with Facebook on, is digital. And this component has 2 parts, essentially. And the first is the extent to which a country's population is connected to the web and have access to the internet and digital tools. And then the second part of it is the government's capability in digital diplomacy. So how effective is the government of a country in engaging internationally through social media platforms. The fourth category is government, so this captures the political values that I mentioned, but it also captures the quality of public institutions and how well government performs. The fifth category is engagement, and this is really about a country's diplomatic engagement. What's their diplomatic footprint? Their embassy network abroad. How many embassies do they host? How many international organizations are they a member of? And then finally, the 6th sub-index is education. And this captures primarily measures around higher education and how globally engaged the country's higher education system is. As I said, soft power is inherently subjective, and so we had to embrace this fact. And so we commissioned new international polling in 20 different countries. And this map shows the countries that we covered. And we tried to cover, and I think we did a decent job of covering every region of the world. And in those regions, we polled people on 7 different factors. And we tried to capture the most likely touch points for countries, trying to, not necessarily an overall measure of how do you feel about, France or Germany or Japan, but how do you feel about these specific aspects of the country. And so those aspects were cuisine, technology products, the friendliness of a population, their contribution to global culture, luxury exports, their foreign policy, and the perceived livability of the country as well. And just to recap, so that's the overall framework of the index. And because our objective with this study was to really get to grips with the tangible soft power assets that countries have on the ground, we prioritized the objective data. So we didn't weight any of the individual indicators, but we weighted the objective data overall as 70% of the total score, and then the polling data accounted for the remaining 30%. So I'll go over the results very quickly. I won't spend too much time analyzing them. And I'd encourage all of you to visit the microsite that we built for this. And I can give more information on that later. Do come find me. The top 5 countries, and this was actually rather to my surprise, especially as an American, not a natural-born British citizen, but the UK came top, followed by Germany, the United States, France, and Canada. So that was the top 5. Korea came 20th, which maybe doesn't look good on this table, but what I should say is that actually that's a really good showing. Japan came 8th, and it was the top-ranked Asian country, but South Korea was the second top Asian country. The other thing to say is that while we published the results for the top 30 countries, we actually collected data for 50 countries altogether. So Korea actually finished 20th of 50 rather than 20th of 30. Hopefully that provides some comfort to any disgruntled Korean colleagues here. But to put this into context for Korea, what does it mean for Korea and for what we're talking about with innovation? Now this is really, really top-level findings. The truth is we collected a great deal of data. There are tens of thousands of data points that went into the creation of this index, and we've really only begun to scratch the surface of it. But at the very top level, what we found is that Korea's biggest strengths were those that one would associate with innovation, most of all. So Korea did very well on the digital sub-index, did very well on the education sub-index, did very well on government sub-index, and actually I think it put in its best performance in the enterprise sub-index, which, like I said, does also measure capacity for innovation. Now the weaknesses, maybe it's unfair to say weaknesses, we could simply say areas for development, and actually I wouldn't say that Korea did really poorly on these compared to everybody else. It's just that compared to the strengths, these were the sub-indices where Korea showed room for improvement. And with culture, this is not to say that Korea's culture is weak in any way. I think Korea's culture is fantastic. And not only that, I would say that contemporary Korean culture is probably the strongest within the Asian region. And it does incredibly well, whether it's K-pop, whether it's Korean films or Korean soap operas that are incredibly popular throughout the Asian region. The issue becomes, once you get farther afield into Western Europe or Africa or North or South America, the cut-through of Korean culture kind of falls off a bit from the appeal that it has wider in Asia. And then on the engagement sub-index, I guess the issue was perhaps Korea would benefit from strengthening its embassy network and maybe getting a bit more involved in other international organizations. But again, this wasn't an overall to say that Korea was particularly weak against other countries. It was simply looking at itself, those areas where it was strongest and those where there was room for development. Now, if we drill down one level deeper to the actual individual metrics and indicators, the 4 indicators where Korea performed the best across the entire index of 66. The first was, we included a metric of how many universities does a country have in the QS top 200 global universities, which are ranked every year. And Korea did very well in this. I think there were 6 in total. We, as I said, we looked at connectivity, and the World Wide Web Foundation put out a e-participation index, which Korea did very well on. A number of our colleagues who have already presented have identified Korea's world-beating performance in R&D spending as a percentage of GDP, which we included. And then also, I'm sure this was mentioned as well, I think it was Dr. Kohn mentioned the global patents as a proportion of GDP as well. Korea was very strong on this. To go one further, I think actually Korea has done amazingly well to develop some commercial brands, some consumer-facing brands that are a huge asset for Korea globally. And so these are very recognizable names. These are household names no matter what country you're in. And in fact, Brand Finance, they do an annual ranking of the value of global brands, and they found Samsung is the second most valuable global brand in the world, behind only Apple, which is a huge asset for Korea. And also Hyundai at 52nd and LG Group at 90th as well. And having these household consumer names is certainly a net positive for Korea's soft power and its brand and reputation. So to get, I suppose, to the crux of what we're discussing, so how are soft power and innovation linked? I fear this is maybe an oversimplified answer, but what I would argue is that they have a very symbiotic relationship, and the relationship between innovation and soft power is essentially one of a feedback loop or a virtuous circle. So one of the things that most affects the reputation, or really the thing that affects a country's reputation the most, is the contribution that it makes to the global community. And producing new innovation that, whether it simply improves the lives of consumers or whether it's solving major global challenges, is something that is ultimately a net benefit to the global community. So the more innovation that a country produces, the more useful it is to the rest of the world. And as this happens, that then increases a country's soft power. It makes them more attractive to the rest of the world. And the benefits of this are then perhaps there would be greater demand for that country's exports. There would be more interest in inward foreign direct investment. You'd be more likely to attract international students to come study at your universities. And you'd be more likely to attract, increasingly mobile global top talent to come and work and innovate in your country. So more soft power will ultimately lead to an increase in the inputs of innovation, and as you bear the fruits of innovation, it then makes you more attractive. So I would say that's essentially the relationship, which is quite an important one. I just want to wrap up now, as I'm sure I'm pushing my time limit. Just a few practical thoughts on what this means for Korea. And I think it's probably worth saying a number of these things are probably already happening, so I don't mean to insist that they're not happening, and they must, but simply that if they are already happening, then it's worth exploring ways in which we could do more of them, I think. So the first, I would say, is just continue to invest in human capital. I think Korea tells a fantastic story of what investment in education can do for a country, and I would think it would be good to continue doing that. The second is to develop more programs to support spin-off businesses from university research programs. I think this was something that was mentioned as well in a previous presentation, that one of the objectives of universities should be outreach, and that means spinning off their research into in practical ways. The third thought I had was doing more to increase international student scholarships or exchanges. This is something I think the US and to a similar extent the UK do particularly well. Attracting international students is a huge advantage. There have been a number of studies that show students who have studied in another country then leave that country with a much higher opinion of that country. They usually then go on to be leaders in industry or academia or politics. Also, they just bring a different perspective and new ideas, which of course is important for innovation. In that same vein, I would encourage Korean universities to engage more in international partnership with institutions, or perhaps set up campuses internationally. So again, this is something the US and the UK do quite a bit. We see it in China, in Europe, throughout the Gulf as well. There are a number of initiatives there. In fact, I know in Qatar and Doha Education City, there are a number of US and UK higher education institutions who are setting up campuses, and I think this is something that would be very good for Korean universities to do, or indeed do more of if they already are. Fifth, I would really encourage the establishment of a sort of special entrepreneurship visa, something that would encourage really talented, innovative entrepreneurs to come and set up shop and work for a while in Korea. And this is something the UK is doing right now they have a program called Sirius, where they're encouraging promising entrepreneurs to come into the UK. And finally, as it's been mentioned a few times, Korea's story of how it's been the only country to go from a donor recipient to a net contributing overseas development aid donor. And I think because Korea does so well in innovation, to look for ways to build innovation into Korea's aid program. So not just sort of funding things, but are there ways that we can bring Korea's capacity for innovation to bear on big development challenges? And those are my parting thoughts, and hopefully an introduction to soft power and how it relates to innovation and what we're discussing here today. Thank you very much.